All right, why don't we get started? Welcome and thanks to all of you who've joined us tonight for the Manhattan DA Candidate Forum. My name is Sean Hecker and I co-chair the New York City Bar's Mass Incarceration Task Force, which is very pleased to be sponsoring tonight's event. I'm joined by my co-chair, Sarah Berger, and task force members Liz Skeen, Alex Conlon, and Tess Cohen, and I want to thank each of them for their hard work in helping to organize tonight's event. I also, of course, want to thank all of the panelists for being here. The City Bar's Mass Incarceration Task Force was created 6 years ago with the launch of a City Bar report that recognized the critical importance of addressing our country's mass incarceration crisis. And during the last 6 years, our task force members, who also work on various other City Bar committees, have continued to explore deeply various elements of a criminal justice system that have brought us to this place where our country leads the world in locking people up and does so in a manner that has a hugely disproportionate impact on people and communities of color. Our work over this past year has culminated in the issuance of a report advocating for comprehensive criminal justice reform in New York State, which we will discuss tonight. That report is called A Pathway Out of Mass Incarceration and Towards a New Criminal Justice System, Recommendations for the New York State Legislature. In a moment, I'm going to ask our task force member, Tess Cohen, to give folks a high-level summary of the report, which has been shared with each of our candidates. Before I do that, though, I wanted to introduce tonight's moderator, Nick Turner, the president and director of the Vera Institute of Justice. To those who care deeply about criminal justice issues, Nick really needs no introduction at all. For the last almost 7 years, Nick has brilliantly led the Vera Institute in pursuing its core priorities of ending the misuse of jails, transforming conditions of confinement, and ensuring that justice systems more effectively service America's growing minority communities. Nick also serves on the Independent Commission on New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform. And Nick's voice has been a very, very important one in our country during difficult times. I was struck by a blog post that Nick authored in the aftermath of Derek Chauvin's conviction. Nick wrote, "True justice for George Floyd means creating a system that provides real safety and security for everyone by building thriving communities that center on individual well-being. Yet the United States spends more time, energy, and money criminalizing, policing, and imprisoning people than helping them, with cities nationwide using almost about a third of their general funds for law enforcement. We spend double on the apparatus of mass incarceration, what we do on public assistance to poor, disabled, and low-income people. This imbalance must be corrected for our communities to thrive." Tonight, Nick will be playing the role of a neutral moderator, but I thought it was important to share Nick's words with this captive audience before we turn to this discussion, because I think they illustrate Nick's very thoughtful leadership around both criminal justice and racial justice issues. So before I turn this over to Nick, I do want to introduce Tess Cohen. Tess recently made the move from private to private practice after spending 8 years as a Manhattan ADA, where she was assigned to and then led the Special Narcotics Unit. Tess has my everlasting appreciation for both conceptualizing and then leading the charge to execute the work of the task force in issuing our blueprint for comprehensive reform. And it is fitting that she be the one to briefly summarize the report for all of you, which will form a basis for tonight's discussion. So Tess, I'm turning it over to you, and thank you.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you everyone for being here. It's an honor to be here. As Sean said, I'm an alum of the office, so this forum is very near and dear to my heart. And I'm here to talk about this report, which contains an extensive list of proposed legislative changes to the criminal justice system in New York. It draws on the work of decades of work done by advocates who have tirelessly tried to change the criminal justice system in New York, as well as people like the Center for Court Innovation, who have run innovative programs based largely on prosecutorial consent to try and imagine new ways of handling cases in the criminal justice system. What we wanted to do with this report was draw together these proposals and these programs and give a cohesive framework through which the legislature can consider a holistic way of reimagining the criminal justice system. And there are two major themes that run through this report. The first is that the criminal justice system has inflicted unnecessary harm on New Yorkers, and particularly on Black and Latino New Yorkers, and that it is incumbent on us to rethink the system and to redress these injustices, and particularly these racial injustices caused by the system. The second is that for too long, the criminal justice system has been a vehicle largely for punishment, and often disproportionate punishment, and often to the detriment of public safety. In current discourse on the task force, we have found that it's often discussed as though criminal justice reform necessarily comes at the expense of public safety, and we reject that notion in this report. And we firmly believe that the evidence shows that thoughtful criminal justice reform actually increases public safety by addressing the reasons why a particular person might commit a crime, rather than punishing them and thereby, in fact, it's exacerbating those root causes of criminal activity. So with those two themes in mind, this report calls for reducing the footprint of the criminal justice system at each stage of the process, and at each stage of the process, trying to refocus on addressing the reasons why people commit crimes, and to, rather than reflexively punish them. I'm not going to go through all the proposals. It's 40 pages and gets pretty wonky at moments, but I am going to share this overview here, which hopefully everyone can see, that kind of gives a summary of the report and the framework that we're working in. So first we asked, what is even a crime in New York State? That we believe there are behaviors that are unnecessarily criminalized in New York State, and also in the city, which has its own set of criminal, of activities that it has criminalized separate from the state. Second, we say if someone does commit a crime and is arrested, do they even need to be arraigned in a formal court system? And we call for taking innovative programs like Project Hope and Project Reset, which divert people accused of low-level crimes like misdemeanor drug possession and petty larceny into programs before they even come to the courthouse. And we call for these to be legislated, mandated, and fully funded. Next, we say if someone is arraigned, should they be convicted? Should they be a person who bears the burden of a criminal conviction with all the consequences that flow forth from it, including difficulties in employment, housing, immigration, and in many other arenas? We call for an expansion of diversion programs for those with mental illnesses and those facing their first felony conviction, and for making the current drug diversion court easier to access. Fourth, we call for a reduction in reliance on incarceration. We call for legislative presumptions of a non-incarceratory sentence for numerous crimes. And we actually call for the taking of programs like the one that currently exists in Manhattan, the Alternatives to Incarceration program, and legislating it. And also moving discretion so it's not solely with prosecutors, but also lies with judges to decide who should be able to take part in programs like Alternatives to Incarceration. Next, we look at the sentencing structure. We call for a host of changes to the sentencing structure to reduce the reliance on mandatory minimums. The single biggest suggestion, I would say, is the ending of predicate and violent predicate statuses, saying that prior criminal history shouldn't mandate incarceration as it essentially does in New York under the predicate and violent predicate statutes, and that rather discretion should be restored to judges to determine how and when a criminal history should impact whether or not someone is incarcerated and for how long. Six, we call for reforming prisons and to make them places that address the root causes of crime rather than inflicting more trauma. I'm going to step out of my role as an advocate for mass incarceration and speak as an individual, and say that, to be frank, I think the pandemic over the last year has shown that we treat people who are incarcerated as though their lives are worth less than other people's. And it is incumbent on us to take a moral stand against this. We call for a huge number of reforms to prisons in this report. And it's both a huge change and the bare minimum of what must be done to treat people in prisons humanely. Seventh, we call for changes to parole to make parole a tool for re-entry into communities after leaving prison rather than a tool of further punishment and incarceration. And last, we look at criminal sealing of criminal convictions and the need for a wider ranging mechanism to ensure that people who have prior convictions do not have to carry the burden of a criminal history for their entire lives. We also add 2 additional caveats and points that we believe people who are believe in reform must keep in mind as they are making these efforts. The first is to remember the frequency with which people who are arrested, convicted, and incarcerated have mental illnesses, and that we have, and that, excuse me, in our failure as a nation to provide mental health care, we have criminalized mental illness. And the second is that we cannot continue to carve out so-called violent crimes in our reform efforts. If we really want to change the system, if we want to increase public safety, if we want to make it more just and more fair, we have to be able to reform how we treat people who are accused of violent crimes. And I'm almost done, but I'm going to give one specific example. There's been a rise in shootings in the last year in New York City, and many have reflexively blamed criminal justice reform, especially bail reform, for these shootings. And one of our concerns with this is that thoughtful reform could actually decrease these violent crimes. For example, Monroe County in New York, up in Rochester, and in Brooklyn, there are these innovative court programs for people who are under 25 who are caught with a gun. And instead of going to jail, they go through intensive supervision and programming, and the results are astounding. The Monroe County Court has a success rate of 82% compared to a failure rate of 77% through the traditional system. Brooklyn has a 22% lower recidivism rate with their gun court. So we believe that when we reflexively blame reform for violence, we make our communities less safe. So that sort of gives an overview of the report, and I will turn it now over to our moderator, and I look forward to hearing what the candidates have to say about it.
Tess, thank you very much, and let me congratulate you and the rest of the task force on a very comprehensive and well-reasoned report. And Sean, I want to thank you very much for your kind introduction. My name is Nick Turner. I'm the president of the Vera Institute of Justice. I feel very fortunate to be able to moderate this discussion today. We have our candidates who will introduce themselves in a moment, but let me just shout out their names: Tahanie Aboushi, Alvin Bragg, Liz Crotty, Diana Florence, Lucy Lang, Eliza Orlins, Dan Quart, and Tali Farhadian Weinstein have all joined us. I want to speak for a moment a bit about how we'll proceed through the next hour and 16 minutes. It'll go as follows. First, I'm going to begin by providing about 5 minutes of contextual data on crime and incarceration in New York and then specifically in Manhattan, just to level set. Second, we'll then turn and give every candidate an opportunity to introduce themselves for 90 seconds. Then we're going to go to questions. I have 4 questions that I've crafted, taking a look at the task force report and thinking about some of the issues that are of particular import today. I will ask each of those questions to 2 candidates. They don't know if they're on the hot seat or not for those questions. They will each have 2 minutes to answer. And then every candidate will have an opportunity to raise their hand and offer an answer to a question for which they have not been selected. So to put it differently, each candidate is going to have 2 bites at the apple. One apple that I choose to give you, and then an apple that you choose to take. So what I'm trying to do here is to keep some level of equity across the group so we can hear from everyone. Hopefully if we make it through that process, again, 2 minutes per answer, then we'll have a bit of a lightning round on a few other key issues, and then leave about 15 or 20 minutes for questions from the audience. I'm going to beg your apology in advance for 2 things. One is for being the little tyrant that I am. I will try to keep time here and make sure that if you are going over 2 minutes, I will ask you kindly just to wrap things up so that we can stay on schedule and get as much content out. And then the second thing is that I'll potentially diverge from the format if it seems like there's a substantive conversation that's important for us to engage in. So apology requested in advance. And now what I'm going to do is to share my screen so that I can begin this session. And if I can just, can everyone see that? Thumbs up, are we good? So I can't tell if everyone can, Alvin, I see you on my screen. Okay, awesome, thank you, I appreciate it. So let's get started. This is just a bit of context again for foundation setting. We'll begin by talking about the fact that we are, if you think about really a 30-year period, we are at a place in this city where we have massively reduced incarceration. This graph only goes to 2017, and if you were to extend it to up until this year to 2021, the current population in the New York City Department of Corrections is around 5,700, down from a high of 22,000. So what many people have referred to as the New York City miracle, which is a reduction in incarceration, but also a reduction in crime. We are very much on the tail end of that. That's important to recognize as we talk about the challenge of mass incarceration and where we sit in New York City. This slide shows you where we are in terms of major felony crime. We are also at the end of a 30-year remarkable trend where major crime is really close to historical lows. And so when we talk about mass, the shootings and the homicides that have ticked up in the past year, we're talking about that as a spike at the tail end of a very long trend. And here's a great indication of that. You will see that homicides in 1990 numbered 2,262. It is true, in fact, that homicides increased in 2020 and have continued to increase in 2021. But if you put that in context, what we're talking about is that homicides are still, at the end of 2020, 30% less than they were in 2000, 76% less than they were in 1993, and 79% less than they were in 1990. So that historical context is important as we think about the levels of violence that exist in the city. It is not to diminish the importance and the concerns that people have for homicides and shootings, but it is merely to put it in context. This next slide shows you that what you see if you listen to the media and read the press, there often is described a major crime spike, often approaching historical levels. If you look at crime types in the country, in the city, what you'll see is that there are a number of specific major crime categories where we've actually seen a reduction. You see it up on the screen: grand larceny, rape, robbery, and felony assault. However, you see the increase. This is from 2019 to 2020 in murder, motor vehicle theft, and burglary. So it's a mixed bag. Different crime types are moving in different directions. This is just another slide that's a little bit confusing to look at it, but the best way that I can describe it for you is that you see this kind of fluctuation happening every year. There are certain crime types that go up, there are certain that go down. We obviously, again, I'm not diminishing the notion that the homicide increase is a spike and is substantial from 2019 to 2020. And then from 2000 and thus far into 2021, we're about 17% over where we were in 2020. But it's a mixed bag. The final slide here that I want to show you is something that I want to get folks to think a little bit about, which is that what we have seen in this city is, in a way, is a retrenchment of the conventional criminal justice apparatus, touching people. So remember the first slide that I showed you, which showed a reduction in incarceration, pretty substantial. Here, what this slide shows you is that there's been about a 50% reduction in arrests in New York City in the past decade, and a commensurate 58% reduction in the jail population. But the budget for police and for corrections has remained the same. So this accounts for inflation. So while both the Department of Corrections and the police department have reduced their activity, the budget has not reduced at all. And that is something we may talk about it a little bit tonight if we get to the lightning round and talk about the DA budget, something that is also similar in the DA budget. So I'm going to stop the share here, but I want to just underscore a few points about Manhattan. One of the things that's important to remember about the borough of Manhattan is that there's a disproportionate number of New Yorkers who are sent to jail from that borough. So 1/3 of all people who go to jail in the city come from Manhattan processing. The same thing goes for prison admissions. There are 32,000 people right now who are in New York State prisons. Of them, 4,460 are sent there through the borough of Manhattan. That's 14%. That is the number one. So Manhattan is the number one supplier of prison population to New York State prisons. And that is, the number is 2 times as many as come from Brooklyn, which is in second place. Finally, we can talk a little bit about racial disparities. Vera did a study back in the beginning of the last decade, which showed racial disparities at almost every point, decisional point within the prosecutorial system, case acceptance, plea bargain, a dismissal, a recommendation for remand, sentencing. Some of the most recent figures show that in the Manhattan DA's office, 41% of people are, that 41% you will find are you're less likely to receive a bail recommendation if you are Black or Latino by 41%. And 30% less likely to have your prosecution declined if you are Black or Latino. So we're obviously talking about a system which still has racial disparities operating within it. So I'm going to now switch over to the question section, and my first question is this, and I'll begin with Alvin Bragg. So Alvin, do you support the Lippman Commission and the city's plan to close Rikers Island? The plan is to close it by 2027. And so by 2026, the jail population, which right now sits at around 5,700, needs to be reduced to 3,300. So the plan includes closing Rikers and building borough-based jails in 4 of the boroughs that are capped at 3,300. Do you support that plan, and what concrete steps, given what we just talked about as the Manhattan being the major supplier of jail admissions, what concrete steps would you take to reduce jail population and get Rikers closed?
Thank you, Nick, and thanks for all the table setting with the great data presentation. I remember going to Rikers as a 19-year-old when I was at the Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem, and it feels like the longest bridge in the country. I believe that the conditions are worthy of closing down, certainly, and so support that. I have concerns about the borough plan, equity issues. In fact, the Staten Island doesn't have one. The construction, some of the environmental issues that would affect downtown near the courts in Chinatown. And I think that the last year is instructive. When we look at, I authored an op-ed about our COVID health releases that we're able to do in response to the pandemic. And you look at my declination policy, which I have on my website, which, as you said, Manhattan is the biggest supplier. I think we can reduce that supply number a long way. And if we take some aggressive steps, some of which are outlined in your report, or the city bar report, I should say, that we can really get the numbers down and do not have to have a massive construction project in downtown Manhattan, which would be, I think, bad for that neighborhood and also not necessary. We need to kind of keep the movement forward to continue rolling back. So I would keep the timetable to shut down Rikers, but would look at not having a massive project in downtown Manhattan, but instead meet the metrics by further reducing the scope of our system. If I have more time,
Alvin, let me ask you a quick follow-up question, which is the law of physics suggests, at least according to the plan, that if you don't have a massive construction program in Manhattan, you're either going to have to force the building more in Bronx, Queens, or Brooklyn, that they will have to be places that maintain a Manhattan detained population. So how do you get around that? Or would you recommend that we keep a facility open at Rikers?
No, I certainly want to close and that to me is a non-starter to keep it open. But I do think we have to look at the placements, right? Staten Island does not have a placement. We could have bigger footprints elsewhere, perhaps. But I do think if we have aggressive, in fact, the input that was used, we've done our own modeling as a campaign and have used a lower number because we think under our declination policy, and I've talked about this on my website, more than 80% of the city's docket is misdemeanors. Of that universe, you've talked a lot about racial disparities. More than 80% of those charged are people of color. Based on my time as a federal prosecutor and based on my time growing up in Harlem, I think many of those cases have nothing to do with public safety, and we can reduce that number significantly.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. One word that I forgot to tell the panel. After you know who the second person is who's been called, if you want to raise your hand and enter in on this question, just raise your hand, either wave madly or do it below. I'll make sure to see you. So this question now goes to Tali, Farhadian, Weinstein, which is, do you support the Littman Commission and city plan to close Rikers, which includes building the 4 borough-based jails, and what will you do to ensure that this supply of jail admissions that Manhattan is responsible for is in fact reduced?
Nick, thank you. Oh, the squares just jumped around. Thank you, and thank you to the City Bar, to the colleagues who are here. And let me just say, before I answer your question, Nick, that I really commend and congratulate the folks who wrote this report, because I think that it has gathered so much of the wonderful innovations in the criminal justice reform space from around the country and in Brooklyn, where I worked, and would ask the legislature to formalize, normalize, and guarantee a lot of those reforms. And I think that that's excellent. I do support the recommendations of the Littman Commission. I think that Rikers is beyond redemption. And there are lots of reasons, many of which are laid out in the report that you cited, that tell us why it is safer and better to have smaller jails near the courthouses in which the incarcerated people are supposed to appear, rather than all the way over at Rikers. And so then, of course, the challenge that you are putting to us is, what would we do in our role as prosecutors to bring the number down and to keep that number down? And let me offer just a couple of things, although so many of the answers are laid out in this report, from pre-arraignment diversion to diversion right at arraignment. Some things that I think we can do. First, in Brooklyn, in the years that I was there, the office, and this was before any legislative bail reform, in 1 year, the office reduced the population that we sent to Rikers by about 50%, simply through better management, by requiring ADAs in misdemeanor cases to justify their requests for cash bail. And they would write reports to the leadership of the office. We review these reports every night. And so, part of it is just about training ADAs who are standing up in court to be more careful, more thoughtful, and more public safety oriented when they are making those requests. But the other thing that I think is worth mentioning as a strategy, Nick, is that the new bail reform has some unfunded mandates in there that I think are really worth developing. So the new legislation lays out different tools that the court can use to help people to return to court and thus allow incarceration to be unnecessary, right? Things like electronic monitoring and counseling during that period. But as far as I understand it, these new innovations are unfunded. So I think it's not just about training ADAs to ask for them and think about them, but also making sure that they are real and not just theoretical options.
Thank you.
And I think it's something the Manhattan DA's office can think about funding, just to complete the thought. Thank you.
I don't see anyone else who has raised their hand who wants to get in on this. So, but I'm curious. Tahanie, talk to us a little bit about your view. Oh, wait. So
yeah, you have Lucy and Diana. Florence had her hand raised, and Ms. Crotty.
oh, shame on me. So Lucy, go ahead. You're on.
Thank you, Tahanie. Thank you, Nick. And thanks to the City Bar for having us this evening. I'm a proud longtime member of the City Bar and have served on committees and task forces, and I know how much hard work goes into producing something of this magnitude. So I'm honored to be able to be a part of the conversation. I've run a national criminal justice reform organization. I've served as an assistant district attorney here in Manhattan, handling the most serious, complex cases. And I'm committed to using the district attorney's office as an engine for dismantling mass incarceration and reckoning with racial injustice. And that includes a commitment to closing Rikers Island. You know, Nick, when you talked about the trends, you said we were at the tail end. And I think that we all hope that we're not at the tail end, that the trend continues downward, both in terms of violent crime and in terms of reliance on incarceration. And I think it is imminently possible to close Rikers. Right now, of the population at Rikers Island, about 1,500 of the folks there are in on Manhattan cases. A meaningful number of those are actually in on VOPs. So one start is that we need to stop technical violations, and that will reduce the number. Then, of course, we have to undertake many of the strategies set forth in the task force report. And I recently put out a policy book that outlines my 27 or so comprehensive policies for how I intend to implement change in the district attorney's office that include declining to prosecute matters that don't belong in the system, diverting cases into public health wherever possible, and ending the reliance on mandatory minimums and on the mandatory persistent violent felony and related statutes. But I should also add that right now there are about 800 people incarcerated in the Tombs, not all on Manhattan cases. And I think we should be prioritizing the Tombs as a location for people who are in Manhattan and who have families in Manhattan. And then I think we need to get creative about how we're going to address this problem without building up the facilities that exist. And of course, they need to be refurbished in a modern way, and they need to provide services and supports to people who are detained. But I think about the fact that I've spent the past few years teaching in New York State prisons, a class I created that brings assistant district attorneys inside New York State prisons. And when I taught an Edgecombe Correctional Facility in Upper Manhattan, they were at about 30% capacity. So that facility needs to be meaningfully updated, but there certainly are other options in and around Manhattan worth exploring that will help enable us to close Rikers, hopefully well in advance of the timeline set forth by the Littman Commission. And I'm committed to using the district attorney's office to facilitate that.
Thank you. And so, Liz, I think you had your hand raised. I want to apologize to you all because I went right to the questions and didn't give you a chance to introduce yourself. So it's like I've let you into the house, and then so what we're going to do is Liz is going to take this question, and then we're going to go. I'm going to say, well, so wait, who are you anyway? What are you doing here? So everyone will have a chance to.
Nick, I'll just say I actually had my hand raised before Liz, but Liz, go ahead. It's fine.
Sorry,
Okay.
Diana.
So I think that the idea of closing Rikers was a noble one, but the numbers don't support it right now. The numbers just simply don't support it. Crime is rising, shootings are up, homicides are up. Felony assaults are up despite what you put up there. So I think we really have to look at what the numbers are and how crime is trending before we make decisions about Rikers. I also think too, it's very interesting how this has become political, and a lot of people here on this panel are trying to go in Chinatown, where there is a vehement opposition to the local jail and the behemoth that it is. So let's just all kind of put it out on the table. There is a lot of community resistance to this community jail. I think, you know, if you look at it, they had defund the police at $6 billion. It's an $8 billion program for redoing these jails. Why are we not reinvesting in some sort of jail where people can be outside? Why don't they take $1 billion of those $8 billion and create a high school with 3 buildings, with a dormitory and a school and maybe a community garden where kids can be outside and they can get a high school education or some sort of associate's degree where they're in while they're there and being held accountable. As part of what your report says is we need to do a better job with prisons and rehabilitating people. So give people the autonomy who are there to go between these buildings, act like human beings, get an education, and we really have an opportunity here. There's a lot of money on the table. It has to be drawn. It's not as simple as I'm saying it, but I'm just saying the crime is going up. The numbers don't support closing it. We need to have a real conversation about it. And I think if we mold the report to what some of your recommendations are, so where that going to jail has a real rehabilitative effect, and really where we go and we want people to not come back from prison, I think these are the real conversations we need to start having. Thanks.
Thank you, Liz. So I hear you saying that let's keep the, you know, we need to reverse the city council's land use law that was passed about closing Rikers down in 2027 and zoning it for something else, and keep that option open. Rikers is essentially an open container, which you can build. It already has 10 facilities, but you can obviously use those and build more if you need. And so that's what I hear you saying that you think is what we need to do. We're going to turn now to just to, again, the introductions, and I apologize. We're going to do this in alphabetical order. So you each get 90 seconds to introduce yourself. So Tahanie, may I start with you?
Absolutely. Thank you all for having me, even though totally okay skipping the intros and jumping into these amazing discussions. My name is Tahanie Aboushi. I'm a civil rights attorney, and my work for the last 10 years has consisted of identifying abusive policies and practices and changing them. And I've changed policy within the NYPD, within our fire department, and has pushed better policies with the Department of Education as well. I'm also somebody that represents victims of sexual assault. And so for me, running for Manhattan District Attorney is about bringing that comprehensive approach to these issues, as comprehensive as this report is that you guys gratefully put together for us and for the community. And this is why we have to elect somebody that has this comprehensive experience as opposed to a one-track prosecutor mind. For me, I've been on the other end of a decision a prosecutor has made. When I was 14, my father was sentenced to 22 years in prison. And my mom essentially was a single parent of 10 kids. And so I understand firsthand how that decision comes out of that 4 corners of that office, comes into our communities and dictates the obstacles and opportunities that will come our way. And so my plan for this office is to shrink its footprint, is to have a comprehensive response on how do we shrink the footprint of this office by declining to prosecute charges that don't impact public safety. And I have the most comprehensive declination policy than any other candidate here. My policies also go further by addressing categories that are considered violent crimes to make sure that we are offering alternatives to incarceration and we have measurements of rehabilitation instead of this knee-jerk reaction and automation of injustice. We go even further to ensure that we're holding police accountable and prosecutors accountable for that misconduct, because it's all part of the process. So while we can combat wrongful convictions at the end, we can also work to prevent them. And then lastly, having a sentencing review unit to ensure that we are reviewing sentences of people who are immunocompromised, that have been sentenced for over 20 years, or those who are sentenced to charges that wouldn't have been brought under my administration. So I'm looking forward to talking more about this detailed, comprehensive process with all of you throughout this evening.
Thank you, Tahanie. Alvin, 90 seconds.
Hi, I'm Alvin Bragg again. And much of my interest in criminal justice started when I was young. I grew up in Harlem during the 80s and had a gun pointed at me 6 times. 3 by NYPD officers during lawless stops, and 3 by people who were not police officers. Those early experiences caused me to focus on both public safety and civil rights. And for the past 20 plus years, I've been fighting for both in the courtrooms. I started off as a civil rights lawyer and a criminal defense lawyer, went to the Southern District of New York, where I was a federal prosecutor, and ultimately went to the New York State Attorney General's office, where I had a number of leadership positions, ultimately serving as the chief deputy overseeing the staff of more than 1,500. And as I indicated in my first answer, I want to reduce the scope of this office and focus it on true public safety issues, the kind that I've addressed throughout my career, and also to work on behalf of the marginalized, like tenants who are harassed out of our homes, also work that I've done. And to close down the racial disparities, which are documented so well in the current report and also in the 2015 Vera report. And all of this work is personal for me. You know, reentry work arises from my professional work, but also my brother-in-law's incarceration and staying with me after that. Public safety, I know those challenges, having had a semi-automatic weapon pointed at me and a homicide victim on my doorstep growing up. The civil rights and police accountability issues, I've lived and know them. So all of this work for me comes not out of my own courtroom experiences exclusively, but also out of my lived experiences. So looking forward to the conversation tonight as well.
Thank you, Alvin. Liz, you're on.
Thanks so much. I'm Liz Crotty. I am the person who's been doing this for 21 years. First, 6 years as a criminal. I was an assistant DA in Manhattan for 6 years in the trial division doing street crime, and then in the investigative division doing complex white collar cases. I went to a firm for 2 years, and for the past 12 and a half years, I have been a criminal defense attorney and had my own firm representing everyday New Yorkers. I understand how the system works on a day-to-day level. I want to manage this office from the top, knowing how it affects everybody who comes into this building. I also have a different take on this because I actually view the district attorney's office as a law enforcement job. And the job of the district attorney is to enforce the laws here in the state of New York. We have to do it fairly and evenly and constitutionally. But I do think that that is ultimately the role. I know how to do this because I've been on both sides of the courtroom. I think, you know, I've been talking about this as a born and bred New Yorker, grew up in Stuyvesant Town. I live an everyday life here in New York. I understand how New York affects people on a day-to-day. I've been calling, you know, for anti-crime to come back since the beginning of my campaign, constitutionally, rebranded maybe, as Eric Adams said, with a more highly trained police force, but that's who got guns off the street. I called for 500 more police officers to come into the subway in an op-ed before there was a quadruple homicide because I ride the train. I saw what was going on. I don't have a do not decline to prosecute list because I think facts are much more important than any policy. So that's my candidacy. That's why I'm here. And, you know, I think we also have to talk about the racial disparities. And I read the whole report, and I do agree with the conclusion of this report, where it talks about if we do not change neighborhoods, schools, give opportunities, and now in a post-corona world, healthcare, where we don't address the racial inequalities that exist in high crime neighborhoods, that is the first step to reducing racial inequalities in the criminal justice system. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Liz. Diana, please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having us. This is an important conversation. I'm Diana Florence. I'm running for Manhattan District Attorney. It's my life's work. I spent 25 years as a prosecutor, and I didn't do it the same old way. I brought groundbreaking domestic violence cases and then switched to corruption. And you know, Nick, as you went over the different slides at the beginning of this webinar, I was struck by one of the major crimes that was left out, and that is corruption. And when we talk about all the other major crimes and we don't talk about corruption, we don't talk about wage theft, which is nearly $1 billion problem when you balance that as compared to regular theft, which is a $330 million problem, then we're only talking about half the story. And the problem with this district attorney's office, and no one knows it better than I have, is that they have overly focused on those crimes that were in your graphs, and they have not focused enough on corruption. And they are connected, because people that do commit these other crimes or are prosecuted for them are often victims of poverty and defunded systems like housing and school and transit. I have a plan to address this. It is based on my work, innovating, using the law to bring people in who never thought that they could come to the district attorney's office, immigrants, workers, and tenants. My work is not simply about what I did from 1,000 feet, it's what I did on the ground. And I did it under very difficult conditions with not a lot of support. As your DA, I will lead this office truly into the 21st century, using its powers ultimately to make sure that everyone has access to justice, no matter who you are, what you look like, or how much money you have. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Diana. Lucy Lang, you're
I
on.
most recently served as the director of the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution at John Jay College, where I work with district attorneys and communities across the country on implementing precisely the kinds of reforms that New Yorkers are now calling for. I am running a campaign that is informed by and supported by the people most directly impacted by the criminal justice system. Families who've experienced terrible loss like gun violence, families who lost loved ones to police violence, including the mother of Sean Bell, women who experienced sexual abuse at the hands of Harvey Weinstein, and progressive prosecutors across the country who are doing the hard work of implementing exactly the kind of reforms that this task force has called for today. I've also had the honor of partnering with Vera in developing what is now Motion for Justice, the beginning of a curriculum for prosecutors to start the process of racial reckoning within their own offices. And that started with a trip with the Reshaping Prosecution Program down to Montgomery to visit the Equal Justice Initiative Museum and Memorial. And that's work that really needs to be disseminated and baked into the legal training curriculum of all district attorneys' offices. I also worked while at the district attorney's office on replicating the original Vera study that's been referenced tonight and creating tailored policies to address the areas of injustice. One of the notable areas in which we saw racial disparities was with respect to the decision whether or not a case would be presented to the grand jury. And as a result of that kind of identification, we're able to create a tailored policy to address that disparity. And I intend to take precisely that kind of very intentional approach, but very much at scale in my role as district attorney, and look forward to continuing the conversation tonight.
Thank you, Lucy. Eliza, if you'd be kind enough to introduce yourself.
Well, hi, everyone. Nice to get a word in edgewise, finally. I'm Eliza Orlins. I'm the only public defender in this race. And I have spent my career working at the Legal Aid Society in the criminal defense practice. And every day of my career has been spent in 100 Center Street, seeing the ways in which these cases are actually brought. And I am so grateful for this incredible report you put together, because these are the things that we see every single day and the ways in which it destroys lives and destroys families. And I'm glad that these issues are coming to the forefront and becoming popular to talk about. But the majority of the people in this race are people who have spent their careers as prosecutors, who have enabled this system, who have charged, robbed to, aided, and on a C-violent felony, sought years in state prison for someone. I've seen those exact cases come through. I've seen, the Berg 3 package dwelling cases come through. I've seen the A2s for Percocets when my client, was a violent predicate felon and facing a minimum of 8 years in state prison for that exact thing. And so the things that you're putting out, these suggestions, are so critically important. And we need a district attorney who truly thinks through these issues, who understands the impact of these issues and understands the way in which this devastates lives. I've represented over 3,000 people charged with crimes here in Manhattan, and I have really gained a deep understanding from having litigated more than anyone else in this race in criminal court and been every single day standing up and seeing the ways in which judges will then, once the DA's office, once we get someone in the DA's office who wants to bring about these changes, judges will become the obstacle. And I've seen the way in which they have been the obstacles to, alternatives to incarceration. The DA's office sure is objecting, and we beg a judge, and judges say, well, who's going to end up on the cover of the New York Post if something goes wrong? It's going to be me. And so the fear-mongering that goes on around ending mass incarceration is something that we really need to push back against. And so, Nick, I'm so grateful for that unbelievable presentation, really showing the ways in which these falsehoods are kind of promulgated, and it's just not true. So anyhow, I'm grateful to be here and to have these conversations with everyone tonight.
Thank you, Eliza. Dan, please introduce yourself.
Nick, thank you for having me to the Vera Institute. My name is Dan Quart. I'm a state assembly member for 10 years and a practicing civil and criminal defense attorney for parts of the last 23 years. My favorite book about the criminal legal system has very little to do with the practice of law. Jill Lovey, an LA Times reporter in the mid-2000s, covered homicides in Los Angeles County. And she wrote something in her book, Ghetto-Cide, that always stuck with me, is that the law is a bully against that which is easy, but a coward against that which is hard. And to me, nothing sums up the last 11 years under Cy Vance than that phrase about what the office has done. Your reports, your statistics, all that bear that out about the great funnel that Manhattan criminal courts are to Rikers Island and everything else. The real issue in this race for me is who's really going to reform this office. And if this was 2009, maybe coming after Bob Morgenthau, maybe one of these 5 prosecutors would be the right person. But my argument since the beginning of this campaign is for those Democrats out there, for those progressives who truly want a reform of this office, then you're never going to get that from a prosecutor. Look at my record in one of the most difficult places to serve, Albany, in the legislature. In 25 years, only 2 pieces of legislation have ever eliminated any section of the penal law. I wrote both of them. If that's the type of change you want, if that's the type of reform you want, there's only one candidate in this race that has the record demonstrating that I can bring it about. That's why I'm running for Manhattan DA.
Thank you, Dan. And Tali, bring us home.
Good evening again, colleagues. I'm Tali Farhadian Weinstein. 40 years ago, I arrived at JFK Airport with my family, fake tourist visas, and what we needed to start a new life in our suitcases. We had come here from Iran to flee the violence and the religious persecution there. And then we went on for 10 years to make an asylum claim and to struggle to get citizenship. And those early experiences have shaped my commitment to public service and my career in the law. I went on to work for 3 attorneys general of the United States. I'm lucky to be able to say now Merrick Garland gave me my first job out of law school. Then I worked for Eric Holder at Maine Justice, and Loretta Lynch hired me to be a federal prosecutor. I've been a Supreme Court clerk for Sandra Day O'Connor. I've worked in the leadership of the Department of Justice and in city prosecution. And most meaningful to me, I spent the last 2 years as the general counsel in the Brooklyn DA's office, which under the leadership of DA Gonzalez, I think modeled so much of how to reform the criminal justice system safely. And indeed, I see so much of our work in the ideas that are set forth in the report that we're talking about tonight. We have arrived at a moment in New York City that is historic. This office is changing hands at the same time that people are feeling worried about their safety and their security and what that means for the recovery of New York. And I believe firmly, as I always have, that we can be fully committed to our mission of public safety, while at the same time continuing to do the work to make the criminal justice system more fair. And I look forward to discussing that with you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. So now back to our regularly scheduled programming. Here is question 2. So the Mass Incarceration Task Force wrote, "Too often, ensuring public safety and criminal justice reform are treated as if they are in tension, with reform coming at the expense of public safety." In this report, we suggest that this is a false dichotomy and that comprehensive, thoughtful reform will make communities safer. So I am posing this question to Tahanie. Tahanie, I suspect that you agree with that statement. But in the shadow of year over year, 17% increase in homicide, 90% increase in shootings, the rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans, and a few high profile incidents in Times Square and on the subway, what steps will you take to address violent crime?
Thank you so much for that question, Nick. The report also said that, tough on crime laws and harsh sentencing and knee-jerk reactions are often a result of these high-profile handful of cases that don't represent the large majority of the data that you presented, which is crime is still decreasing, and we have seen an increase in alternative measures. And so when we talk about anything from hate crimes to violent crimes, we have to understand that here in New York City, we have 5 prosecutor's office, 5 district attorney offices, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the AG's office, the Special Narcotics Prosecutor, the largest law enforcement agency in the country, and we're still seeing an uptick in some crimes. And that's because we can't ignore the pandemic, that people have been thrown into worse situations, that there's economic depression, there's mental health issues, there's health issues. Our children's schooling has been uprooted. And so the answer will always be beyond prosecution and incarceration. This is when we lean into resources. This is where we ensure that to ensure stability, because for me, I define public safety as stability. Do people have housing, education, employment, mental health services, so that they can get what they need, and we can ensure that we're interfering with that cycle of violence. And moreover, those that do actually come into contact with our criminal justice system, what are all the alternatives? What are rehabilitation, our measurements of rehabilitation? And that's why things like bringing organizations and programs like Common Justice to the DA's office is going to be imperative. People who are coming into contact with our office for the first time in our life, we have to ensure that prosecution and incarceration is a last resort if we can help it. Because as the report also mentions, that once you're tagged, then your obstacles and opportunities are dictated for you. And it traps people in this cycle of not only being legally discriminated against from social services, but being very difficult to get on their feet and move away from the influences that push them into the decisions of crime. So for me, that comprehensive response, resources, alternatives, bringing our partners into the decision-making table, and always focusing on rehabilitation and preventing recidivism is how we're going to keep crime down and not buckle under the pressure that the fear-mongering is trying to push us back into those dark days where these numbers start to rise again.
Thank you, Tahanie. Eliza, could I ask you to take on the same question?
Absolutely. And, you know, this is something that I've seen as a public defender. I've seen people be accused of things that have been considered violent crimes, things like gun possession, you know, representing kids as young as 16 who've been charged with gun possession, who, you know, the district attorney's office has wanted only to give a criminal record for the rest of their lives to lock up. And instead, when we've pushed for programs and enabled people to successfully complete those programs, we've seen the massive and overwhelming success of people who do have the ability to participate in alternatives to incarceration. But obviously, you know, a violence reduction strategy can't rely exclusively on incarceration the way it always has. You know, there are so many tools we can be using. There are so many evidence-based and data-driven ways in which we can actually reduce violent crime. And we need to be thinking about you know, engaging social services for people, interventions, and making sure that these are things that people have access to, and not just knee-jerk, you know, locking people up the way the Manhattan District Attorney's Office always has. You know, as you said, the statistic that I found, actually, the one that I wrote down, and I was like, did I know that we supply 14% of New York State prisons? And it shouldn't be surprising, because I've seen, you know, over the decade plus that I've been a public defender, you know, how many clients of mine end up going to state prison on these charges, and then they're released, and within 1 week of release, oftentimes are ending up back in arraignments on my desk, you know, reoffending, because we're not doing anything to address the underlying issues that people are facing. So we need to make sure that we think through these things. You know, I think your report lays out a lot of important issues, but I think that, you know, the district attorney really has the ability to think through how to address issues of violence, but also, you know, people who have previously been convicted of violent crimes. As you know, that's a massive sentence enhancer, and it's something that, you know, needs to be taken into consideration with all the mandatory minimums that we have.
I don't see, is there anyone else who would like to jump in on this?
I would.
Diana, please, 2
Thank you.
minutes.
Yeah, so look, we've talked about the fact that some of the crime surge is real and some of it is perception. But, you know, let's talk about what's real. I mean, I believe it was just this morning, and apologies with the pandemic, I lose track of which day is which that I've read things, but there was a terrible crime spree on the subways, which, you know, based on reports, and I don't know this to be true, just what I've read, were based on gang initiations where multiple people were stabbed. Now, some of the people that were accused are young. Some of the people are properly sent to family court, but we also need to make sure that there's accountability. When someone is hurt, when they're a victim of a violent crime, we need to balance accountability with humanity. So what that means is jail should be on the table, but we also need to find a way out of jail. So it's simply not just defaulting to the old way of just saying you're going away to X amount of years, but looking at the root causes. What brought those individuals to a point where they thought it was okay to go onto a series of subway trains and stab people? And when we do that, right, when we actually ask those questions, then we can actually get to the root causes. My plan is to actually start the cases thinking about where they're going to end. And that means actually using our powers, using what I call a village model, really doing a workup and thinking about, even if someone is going to go to jail or to prison, that we are actually thinking about how we're going to get them out and what they're going to do so that they get off the recidivism track. And that means partnering. I didn't say in my opening statement, I have 18 labor unions supporting me. And that's because of the work I've done. And the work, of those labor unions has not just simply been about middle-class jobs, which of course you can't underestimate, but it's also been about understanding that many people, especially in construction, have justice impact, and they've been able to change their lives because of what union membership gives them. So we can partner with those types of unions. They have apprenticeship programs, they have education programs, they have leadership programs. The DA's office can work with them so that even those individuals who've committed unspeakable violence, they can be held accountable. They might go to prison, but at the end, they can come out and have a path to back into the community.
Thank you, Diana. Anyone else want in on this question? If not, I wanted to just raise Eliza, and then I'm going to ask you, Tahanie, the same question. If you could just answer in 30 seconds. Is there anything that you see that the Manhattan District Attorney's Office is doing right now around violent crimes that you would say, yep, they got it, that's right, we're going to leave it as it is?
I mean, there are a very small number of cases, a handful of cases each year where someone is able to enter mental health court. And, obviously the report touches on that. And so obviously it should be expanded and we should be engaging in mental health court. But I've seen client after client after client get rejected from mental health court when it was something that was an obvious necessity. So I can't praise them for doing just the absolute bare minimum.
Okay, Tahanie?
Yeah, I think the district attorney's office is still considering whether or not alternatives to incarceration can be applied and where they can be applied. So it's a matter of opening that door for issues just like this. And I see someone in the Q&A talked about prior arrest and the shooting in Times Square, which was very scary. It's where my office has been for the last 10 years, where I'm always pretty much every day, if not every week. We have to talk about how do we start addressing these root causes of why they're happening as opposed to these knee-jerk reactions. And I think that a lot of the community-based organizations have been trying to get into the DA's office to start addressing the root causes, have slowly opened that door up, and we can run with it once it's open.
Thank you. So here's the third question. And so we've talked, again, about the disproportionate share of folks coming from Manhattan prosecutions into the prison system. The Bar Association report recommends a number of things, ranging from repealing plea bargaining restrictions, creating a presumption of non-incarceratory sentences for misdemeanors, low-level felonies and drug felonies, and funding alternatives to incarceration programming, as well as making sure that we're considering those options for people who are being prosecuted for crimes of violence. Liz, let me ask you, you spoke about your concern about the rise in crime, which maybe might suggest that you want to keep all the tools available that are currently in your toolkit. Is there anything in what the task force said around reducing prison sentences that you agree with, and how would you go about implementing them?
Well, I think we have to look at the facts of each and every case. And I understand, in the prior answer, everyone was talking about getting to the root cause, but I think the root cause is generational. And I think the root cause is it's two things. We have to deal with the problem that is in front of us right now, and then we have to deal with how do we keep people out of jail and keep people out of the system. And I think when we look at root causes, that is more generational, that is more lifestyle, is that the purveyance of the district attorney's office to be involved in before anyone has even been committed a crime? So I think these are the tough questions that we have to look to. I think that when we are looking at, to your question though, I think one of the things that I think what the overriding thing about your report that I think is very true, and I agree with Eliza, is that judges have to get more discretion. I think we have to give. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to but when you were talking about,
I didn't say that. I didn't say that.
No, but I was talking about what you were saying about judges.
I said they're going to become the obstacle. Once I'm
Yeah.
district attorney, judges will become the obstacle because I'm not going to ask for money bail and they're still going to set it.
Okay, well, I didn't want to misquote you, sorry. So I think, but the thing is, I think we need to give a lot of discretion that is talked about in the report back to judges. I think whether or not alternatives to incarceration should be given sometimes should not only be in the purveyance of the district attorney's office. I think that the judges can make those decisions. I think also too, when you were talking about mandatory minimums and persistent, I think I would advocate for getting rid of the persistent violent felony statement, but keep the discretionary one, because I think that that's more to the point that I'm talking about is some of the things, but the overriding thing too in this report that I did want to mention is that there's no real mention of victims and what's the victim role in all of this, and what is the victim's role in criminal justice reform, and how loud should their voice be? And I think that that's something yes, we need to have criminal justice reform, but I also think we actually, we are representing the people of the state of New York, and sometimes we are that includes the victims of crime. And I think that sometimes goes untalked about.
Thank you, Liz. Diana, let me pose the same question to you. Let's agree, or you can agree to disagree that that we obviously default to incarceration more. Certainly in Manhattan, you're seeing the high supply of people into New York State prisons. Are there things that are in the report that the task force wrote that you would adopt as DA?
Yeah, well, I do think that we need to be looking more holistically at each case, certainly. And when it comes to sort of saying, it's nonviolent, therefore it shouldn't have jail, and it's violent, that's just a false definition. As a corruption prosecutor, one of the frustrations was I went after companies that had falsified major safety tests in scores of New York City landmarks. And they, getting jail in those cases was nearly impossible. And so what we need to be doing is looking at the harm that is caused. And again, it's not simply about, incarceration or not. And I think oftentimes, and one of the great things about this being a bar association forum as opposed to the general public is we can get a little more into the weeds. And, when we think about the weeds, people, the general public often thinks that it's either prosecuting or not. Prosecuting means jail. I've never seen it that way. That's not what I've done in my career. As DA, I will make sure that there is accountability and jail where it's appropriate. And when I say appropriate, it means when the harm is so great that we need to be implementing it in order to get justice for the victims, justice for our community to see that when you steal millions of dollars from taxpayers, when you endanger pedestrians and workers and tenants and everyday New Yorkers, that you suffer a consequence. But again, we also need to balance that with the idea that nothing should be, an indelible. This is not the time of Moses where we etch things into stone. We need to be malleable in understanding that even when there's accountability and even when there's jail, ultimately, we should be open to revisiting cases. And if someone years after have shown to be law abiding, being open to revisiting and perhaps expunging those cases.
Thank you, Diana. So I see Dan Quart and Tali Farhadian Weinstein's hands up on this question. So Dan, on to you, and then to you, Tali.
Yes. Judicial discretion is the problem And that's the problem that's gotten us into the mess that we're in. We don't need more judicial discretion. We need less. We need more clear lines about what is and what is not acceptable. And that has to come from the legislature, where I've been fighting for those clear lines and bright lines. Four and a half years ago, before it was easy, before it was popular, I wrote legislation that ended cash bail. Why did I do that? Because 40 or 50 years of using a dangerous standard, which does not appear anywhere in the statute with judicial discretion, that toxic mix has led to a disproportionate number of people being in Rikers Island, disproportionately people of color, mostly Black and brown men. So to say historically, for any perspective that judicial discretion we need more of, belies the 50 years of preceding history, which suggests just the opposite. And that really is the rub here in this race, Nick, on the difference. Many of the candidates in this race, mostly the prosecutors, believe that they can use their judicial discretion better, that because they have better ideas than Cy Vance, that they themselves can ensure better outcomes. I reject that notion. It is the discretion in and of itself that leads to the bad outcomes. That's why I've set for a policy of no cash bail. That's why I have a declination list. That's why I'll bring down charges from felonies to misdemeanors. That's why I'll decline to prosecute things like driving with a suspended license, which has a clear disproportionate racial outcome. I disagree with the notion of discretion only because there's 50 years of history which says it leads to terrible outcomes, which I think is reason enough.
Thank you. Tali.
Nick, it was a really broad question, so I thought I would answer it by identifying 3 themes that I saw and sharing my appreciation and my agreement with them as strategies for reform. One is to switch up some defaults. And so we had some good success with this in Brooklyn when we instituted a rule that the default position should be to support parole at the first opportunity. It was just that, a default. And if you wanted to oppose parole, and often there are good reasons to do that, you'd have to get supervisory approval. And I think that, and we use that mechanism in other ways as well. So I do think that ultimately the kinds of reductions that you're talking about require that kind of device or benefit from that kind of device. Second, I am on the side of discretion here, and it's why I appreciate the many recommendations that you made for reducing sentencing by removing many statutory provisions that function like mandatory minimums. And I should also say, create a conflict between truth in charging on the one hand and wanting a just and proportionate result on the other hand. So I think all of that is really excellent. And then the last, and I can't say this enough, is that putting this on the legislature is really important in terms of funding, because in my experience, sometimes there just wasn't anything to divert to or an off-ramp that led somewhere. You highlight, for example, in this report, restorative justice and the programs run by Common Justice and by CCI. I believe that in Brooklyn, we were putting cases in there at their maximum capacity, and there was always an overage. I think we've gone a long way around the country and in the city and in developing some diversion programs or alternative to incarceration, but they need to become much more regularly available and stable if we are going to do the things that you call for in this report.
Tali, thank you. So those of you keeping score at home will recognize that that there are only 2 people remaining who will have a forced bite at the apple, and that is Dan and Lucy. So here's my question to you, Dan. We'll start with you. So you got to talk it and then you got to walk it, and so those are obviously 2 very different things. And so should you be elected as the Manhattan District Attorney, what will you do in your first 100 days post-election, and how will that reflect what you understand about institutional management and change management?
Yeah, important question. First, I'll end cash bail, replicate my policies consistent with the legislation I drafted 4 or 5 years ago. Secondly, I'll implement my declination of prosecution list to ensure low-level criminal conduct. Third, I'll take a full look at the personnel within the office. We'll take a case like drug offense case, whether it would go to previously to either go to Bridget Brennan, one of trial bureaus 30, 40, 50, or the violent crimes if it involved quote unquote gang. That lack of symmetry has led to terrible outcomes within the office, punitive outcomes, and I'll have to ensure better management of that. And then a whole new policy on recruitment, retention, and changes deep within that go well beyond the leadership team. Also, if you look at Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, it's a 28% changeover in the personnel in the office. I think you need changes that go well beyond just a change of the leadership team. Last, a full-on review of the sex crimes unit within the office. I was the first candidate to set forth the detailed 9-point plan on exactly how I would go and do it. The names are well known to Manhattanites, Epstein, Weinstein, but the problems are deeper and more systemic. And lastly, you have to have the guts to do it. This is a difficult job, but I've been in the political arena. I've taken on difficult issues, and most significantly, I've stood before the voters 6 times in 10 years when I fought for bail reform, when I fought 7 years over the governor's vetoes on gravity knives. I'm the only one in this race who stood in the political scrum that is political life and stood up and fought for what I believed in, and even doubled down on it when it may have not been the most popular in my district. So it's good to have ideas, and I have them. I've laid them out, but it's more important to have a district attorney who has the political experience and the chops to actually execute on it.
Thank you, Dan. Lucy, what would you do in your first 100 days, and how does that reflect your understanding of change management and institutional management?
I've worked alongside some of the most progressive prosecutors in this country who have been doing the work of implementing these policies. And it's clear that it is not just a policy question, that it is largely a cultural question. And so there are any number of things that I can and will do in the first 100 days that will be part of effectuating that change, including ending the reliance on cash bail, including changing the performance metrics so that assistant district attorneys are tracked and incentivized to be deeply engaged with communities, to work closely with victims, to dismiss cases where appropriate rather than pursue them, and no longer judged based on convictions and sentence length and the kind of outdated metrics that are used. But the bigger project of culture change is going to take more than the first 100 days. And I am in this to make generational change, Nick. And that requires a kind of deep commitment to working alongside people, to expose them to people and experiences outside their own, and to persuading people of the moral merits of ending mass incarceration and reckoning with racial injustice. And one way that I have led the charge to do that is creating with the college and prison course I described in my first answer, which brings assistant DAs inside prisons week after week to get close to and work alongside incarcerated New Yorkers. It serves the function not just of creating a final project that results in innovative policy ideas, which it does, but also of beginning to break down the barriers between prosecutors and the community they serve. And in a recently published study of the initial cohorts of the course, it actually made the prosecutors significantly less likely to pursue punitive responses in their cases. And that's the kind of long-term commitment to changing hearts and minds in the district attorney's office that I intend to implement well beyond my first 100 days.
Lucy, thank you. It looks like Alvin might be gearing up to take a bite at the apple. Is that right? Is that why you unmuted?
It is. I'm preferring to think of it as like chocolate cake and not an apple, but I want to take a bite. Yes. So I wanted to kind of talk a bit. I have a day one memo on my website that lays out a lot of things, although like others, I think it's, really thinking about culture when I lay out the various ways to do it. But I really think we got to look at management experience, right? I ran the Attorney General's office as chief deputy overseeing a staff of 1,500, and I draw my plans from some of those experiences. So, for example, it's curious to me that there's like no full-time kind of gatekeeper. The person who's in charge of the early case assessment bureau is rotating. That to me is a management change that I would make. Have that person who's the gatekeeper. This goes back to your very first question about the scope of the system and who's being detained. To me, that's like a executive leadership position. That's someone I want to be talking to every day. So that's one example. And then on hiring and retention, I think we need to just call it what it is. I mean, so I grew up in Manhattan, spent a career in government. I did not go to the Manhattan DA's office. I did not feel like that was an environment I want to work in. We've got to change that. We've got to reach out to our communities. And some of this is encouraging people. When I was at the Attorney General's office, my strategy of hiring was hire the whole person. So for me, I would show up, on Sundays for my Sunday school class in a suit. People knew that, but that was part of who I was. We got to value whole people. That will help us draw upon sort of the full beauty and diversity of Manhattan. It also changes the culture, because when you hire people expressly because of that, they're then looking at everyone else in the system as a whole person, the person accused, the juror, the stenographer. So that's really key. And the last thing, because I think you're about to gear up to tell me I'm out of time, is we got to be very, very conscious about, we've all talked about racial data. Your report talks about it. Vera did the groundbreaking report in 2015, which you mentioned. I've done something like that with the stop and frisk report we did at the Attorney General's office, documenting this. We've got to use this historical data, not just as a look back, but in real time as management tools. And so when we talk about racial disparities, we have to hold people accountable around that metric as well, and use the data and hold our bureau chiefs accountable. You can't have like cases being treated differently, and we can do that in real time with data tools now.
Thank you, Alvin. Tahanie, Eliza, go ahead. I was going to say that you didn't have your shot at it. So
thank you. I appreciate it. And I raised my hand when Lucy was talking, because, I think that something she said was, I really kind of latched onto, which is that she wants to incentivize assistant district attorneys to engage with the communities. Well, I can tell you as a career public defender that the problem is assistant district attorneys, many of them don't see the people who are being charged with crimes as people. There was a discussion on information and belief. It's my understanding that there was a discussion within the Manhattan District Attorney's Office recently about using dehumanizing language, and many of the entrenched prosecutors there did not want to stop using inmate, felon, defendant, criminal. They don't want to even not use dehumanizing language. So, I think that a lot of the people who are running for this office are saying the same things, are saying the progressive things, are saying we should be ending mass incarceration, are saying the things that now it feels like mandatory to say, or else you are not on the right side of history. But I think that what people need to think about when they are casting their vote in this non-ranked choice election is who they can actually trust to implement these desperately needed reforms, who has been fighting for these things for their entire career. And as the only public defender in this race, these are the issues that I have always spoken out about. These are the things that I've always fought for. And so when we talk about culture change, or knowing, how to incentivize different outcomes at the DA's office, it's about bringing in people who are going to share the values of our elected district attorney, someone who will want to surround themselves with people who truly want to bring about these desperately needed reforms. So that's the final point I wanted to make. And thanks, Nick, for that second bite.
So we're now going to move to Tahanie. I don't know if you ever got your second bite, but if we can keep moving unless there's something you wanted to add to this or anything else that had been mentioned.
No, I mean, do we have a hard stop at 8? I know my eye's on the clock too. So
I think we are.
Okay. I would like to make sure that we can have questions from the audience, so I can.
Yeah, there are a few questions. So I'm going to mix up a little bit of the lightning round and some of the questions from the audience. So there's a question from the audience about the budget of the district attorney's office. I believe that it is roughly around $125 million. It doesn't count a lot of fringe and pension and stuff like that number. While that is the current budget, there's been a 50% reduction in case intake from 2013 to 2019, and the budget has continued to grow. So by a show of hands, when Color of Change asked you all if you were willing to commit to reducing the budget of the DA's office by 50%, only Eliza and Dan said yes. So I'm giving you all a bite at a smaller apple.
That's not accurate.
That's not accurate? Okay.
It was Eliza and Tahanie.
Eliza and Tahanie, okay. So for the rest of you, you got a bite at a smaller apple. Given the growth in the budget, the reduction of case intake by 50%, would you commit to working to reduce the budget by 33%? Raise your hand if you agree. So Dan.
To reducing the budget, Nick, in an intentional way, but would be picking a number out of the air to commit to a particular percentage.
I imagine that that's probably the objection of some of the others here.
Yeah, this is like big net
If
too.
I could
But
answer.
Nick, the big question is though, how can you reduce the budget with discovery reforms and the obligations of discovery reform and getting all of the that is a big increase in the budget with having to do the compliance with discovery and all of the different machinations that has with and technologically and everything else. So I mean, I think it's a hard question to answer when things have changed with the discovery, which I think makes up a lot of what the budget increase also is.
Tahanie, you wanted to jump in,
Yeah,
and then
I
Dan.
wanted to just kind of answer Liz's question here.
Please.
Like you mentioned, and this is often unnoticed, is that as the intake decreases, the budget increases. And every time, with the discovery reform and the criminal justice reform that came out, I think the last session, it was 36 million that was given to the DA's office to accommodate this. And when you look through it, it's going to prosecutors, investigators, support staff that are redacting discovery, that are trying to keep up with this short time frame. But really what we haven't done is reform the process at the front end. We're still prosecuting low-level offenses. We're still prosecuting mostly people who are coming into contact with this system for the first time in their lives. We're prosecuting a heavy misdemeanor docket, right? And then on the back end, we're saying, well, we can't keep up with the constitutional rights and protect people's constitutional rights because we're still prosecuting at a high amount, even though majority of these cases are ending in a plea. So I think you can't just look at that back end stuff. We have to start looking at what the cases this office is taking, where the money is going. And when we talk about reform, are we actually reforming, or we're just hiring more people to tweak these systems without ever focusing on shrinking the footprint of this office? So the whole thing needs to be restructured.
And Dan, you wanted to get a word in on this, and then we'll move on to the next question.
2 words. I disagree with Ms. Crotty. Not surprisingly, but one of the most pathetic things was watching Cy Vance go before the city council and complain of poverty with the $500 million forfeiture fund, $160 million budget that he could not comply with his constitutional standards. Talk about lack of management skills. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office has enough money to comply with the discovery laws that I fought for in the legislature for 10 years. Despite Mr. Vance's assertions to the contrary. Secondly, the problem with the 50% number, if you were to comply with that in your first term, is essentially a $20.8 million reduction. And that would have to come within 120 days of one of us taking office if you were going to do it in your first term. Knowing something about the legislative practice, the budget practice, to actually come before the city council, to outline in 120 days of you taking over, that number, 50%, that would get you 12.8% over 4-year annually, is just not realistic. So I would only promise what I could deliver, which is a reduction of a footprint, but not at the 50% clip that was asked by one of the questionnaires previously in this campaign.
Understood. Alvin, did you have your hand raised? If you have a quick 30-second thing, then I'm going to ask the last question and turn things back over to Sean to close us out.
Briefly, so I mean, for me, it's not about the discovery reform. I believe in shifting the footprint. Many of those cases we shouldn't bring in the first place, but it's about the things that are underreported and underenforced now. Sex crimes. We've got more than 100 toxins that emit from the blood and the urine before we can detect. We got to invest into those cases. Every one of us has talked about wanting to do tenant harassment cases and wage theft cases. I've built those cases. They're long, they're complicated. Public corruption, there's so much, the list is long, but there's so many things I just wanted to focus us on. Even if you, like me, really want to drastically reduce the footprint, there's so many other types of cases that are so important with real harm that we need to bring, and those do cost money to develop and build. I know that because I've done that.
Great, thank you, Alvin. So last question for everyone, and What you're going to be able to do is to give a sentence answer. We're going to go in reverse alphabetical order. So Tali is going to start with you, and then we're going to climb back up the ladder. 4 years from now, you're the incumbent. You're running for re-election. You're here at this forum again. What's the headline of the single most, not, I don't want to like, a big bucket full, the single most important thing or change that you have made in your 4 years as DA? So Tali, let's begin with you.
I've transformed and created a national model for how we investigate, prosecute, and deal with gender-based violence.
Thank you. Dan.
Dan Quart transformed the Manhattan District Attorney's Office as he promised.
Eliza.
Eliza Orlins was able to preserve public safety and reduce incarceration dramatically.
Lucy.
District Attorney Lucy Lang abided by her comprehensive policy commitments as District Attorney, which addressed mass incarceration and began the process of reckoning with racial injustice.
Diana.
Diana Florence changed the portfolio of the District Attorney's Office away from overly focusing on crimes of poverty and focusing on crimes of power, and thereby democratizing access to the office. No matter who you are, you will have justice.
Liz.
Liz Crotty kept New York safer, and I trusted her to do the right thing.
Alvin.
Alvin Bragg delivered both safety and fairness, rejecting the false dichotomy that we must choose between the two.
And finally, Tahanie.
Tahanie Aboushi addressed systemic racism through a comprehensive declination policy that ensured resources into our communities while also building trust by holding police accountable for a stable community for all New Yorkers.
Thank you very much, all of you. I wish that we could spend more time doing this. It feels massively superficial given as much knowledge and passion and aspiration that's in this room. So very, very much appreciate it. Sean, I'm going to turn things back over to you.
Well, on behalf of the City Bar and the Mass Incarceration Task Force, I want to thank all of the candidates for bringing it. That was a spirited, substantive, interesting discussion that I think gave those of us who dialed in a real opportunity to understand what each of you is about. So thank you, and I thank you for reading our report, which I hope will continue to be part of the conversation. And lastly, thank you, Nick. That was a wonderful job of moderating. I think you have another side career in the making. And I really appreciate the time and effort you put in preparing and doing such a wonderful job. So thank all of you, and thanks for those of you who signed on tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Good
Take
night,
care.
everyone.